All right, just welcome to my very first ever YouTube Google Hangout broadcast. This is so that I can relay to my instructor and also to my classmates in it's a scientific writing class at CU Boulder. Um, just want to make sure that I can give commentary to our directed readings assignment this week. And make sure that everyone can have a fair shot at understanding what I'm looking at here. So with that, I'd like to start my PowerPoint here. Okay, here we are. So I am really into cycling. I really love everything behind cycling in the form of science, the development of aerobic capacity is pretty darn interesting. I love working with people in the gym as well and saying, hey, there are some greater strength gains to be had. Well, in cycling, you can almost see it in this picture here. There's different kinds of contractions. Your calf muscles contract isometrically throughout the pedal stroke. Your quadriceps extend, and your hamstrings pull your leg backwards. And those are concentric muscle contractions. Eccentric is a little bit different. It's like if you take your dumbbell at the gym and you pull it up towards you in an arm curl, that's concentric, but coming back down is eccentric. And what we're looking at is people training using eccentric forces to see if there's a gain worth looking at over just training purely concentrically, just always pulling up with no force on the way back down. Okay, so here's the articles I'm looking at. We have Sager, Arvidsson, and Thorsten studying specific effects of eccentric and concentric training on muscular strength and morphology in humans, asking what's the difference between eccentric and concentric muscle training in relation to morphology, how your muscles grow and such, and strength adaptations in the knee extensor muscles. All these studies focus on the quadriceps, or the knee extensors. Then we have Higby, Kirtan, and Warren III, and Pryor, looking at the effects of concentric and eccentric training on muscular strength and cross-sectional area and neural activation. And so they ask, what are the differences in strength, cross-sectional area, which was also examined by Sager, Arvidsson, and Thorsten, and neural activation, which was not consistent across the board, but we'll take a look at it. So what are the differences between these variables here? Is there a difference between concentric and muscle contractions in women? They only studied women to make sure there was no previous experience in training. I think that's a good approach as well. The first and the last here, Colleen and Tesh, as well as Sager, Arvidsson, and Thorsten, did their studies purely on men. So this gives us a good general idea of the strength gains that are being had by men and women. So Colleen and Tesh were very specific in studying the effects of eccentric and concentric muscle contractions in resistance training, which all of these studies are doing. I really love to work with the strength training as a personal trainer, and I'm really interested to see what their findings were. So is there a difference, they ask, in strength gains by training purely concentrically, so only concentric muscle contractions, or are there the same or better results occurring with combined eccentric and concentric training. So they, unlike the others, when they studied eccentric contractions, they paired it up with the concentric training, which I guess that's kind of like training normally, versus training super specifically. So these will be interesting questions to look over. So here are the studies. Sager had 10 moderately trained men. They measured knee extensions with a dynamometer, which that's up in the top left-hand corner. And then they looked at cross-sectional analysis, or the area that was gained. In training, we call this hypertrophy, the growth of a muscle cell. So they looked at it using an MRI machine and also using muscle biopsy to determine muscle fiber distribution. You have different kinds of muscle fibers, and they kind of grow to different sizes. So these are important factors to look at when you're gaining strength. And also losing weight. So Higby had 84 women. They were all about 20 years old, plus or minus half a year. They had no previous resistance training. So they measured the knee extensions as well. They also used the MRI to determine the area of a cross-section in the legs. And they did report electromyographic activity, noting the neuromuscular connections that were being made. This wasn't consistent across the board, so I'm not really going to dive too much into them. Colliander and Tesh used 34 males without previous resistance training experience. Again, these guys didn't measure concentric and eccentric muscle contractions combined and concentric solo. So their results thought might be a little bit different. I'm actually surprised where they ended up. So they measured leg extensions using, again, the dynamometer, as well as using the tool of the squats machine and doing a 3 repetition maximum half squats. So I tried to picture that. This is a full squat up in the top right-hand corner, but you kind of get the idea. This is what they were having people do. What was on the left and what was on the right, and taking measurements in vertical leap and a few others that were not consistent across the board. I'll focus on what they found using the dynamometer. Here's a quick summary of the details. I'll let you look this over. So again, Sager used men that were physical education students. They were well trained. Higby used women, so they had no previous weight training experience. It seems to be a little less common for women to participate in. Men in Colliander's study had no experience. And then the measurements we've talked about, protocols for over 10 weeks for Higby and Sager. Sager using both legs, right and left, separately to see the differences made. Higby had people come in 3 times a week, do 1 less set of 10 repetitions, and allowed for some recovery time to be recorded. That's really important in training clients. I won't go into that, but that's important that they did that. And then they asked each lady to reach a certain force marker each repetition. I think that was pretty important in looking at their studies. I think the reason for that being that they could train by power, train by force, and make sure that that what they were doing was accurate and kind of isolated in a way. I know I'm just rambling. Let me move on. So Colliander and Tesh did a little bit larger, longer study with some more sets and reps. So again, they were looking to measure both the eccentric and concentric together in quadricep muscle actions, and also just concentrically solo, in this 3 times a week. So the variables are going to be important for us to look at here. And you can see the units they're measured in on the bottom row. How they measured this with the dynamometer was essentially velocity at a given angle. So when you move your leg forward, there's a speed at which you execute the exercise. That makes a difference between whether you do it slow or fast. There's some factors that go into that, but they can measure at different points along that movement how much force you're creating, and how it's measured in torque. So Sager took that measurement and measured for peak torque and also their muscle fiber composition. Higby measured average torque. They did have some peak torque in their study that they looked at, but the trend was the same. They only reported average torque. So the electromyogram was measured for them. Again, that's not terribly important for our purposes today. And then they also looked at the cross-sectional muscle fibers, and that was measured in centimeters and micrometers, depending on who you looked at here. Colliander used peak torque at their angular velocities. They also looked at vertical jump height, 3 repetition half squats, and then the muscle biopsies. So you can kind of see some similarities, some differences in what they measured. I think there are some different purposes for measuring those. Colliander's definitely very practical in their application of having vertical jump height and 3 repetition maximum measured. But what's consistent here is that they were measuring for torque. That's what I'd like to look at. So here's our torque information. Essentially, it's showing that no matter what you did, you showed an improvement. Now, whether that was significant or not is a little bit different. So what we're looking at here essentially is the question of whether concentric and eccentric muscle contractions make a difference. You can see the eccentric training groups made larger and more significant gains than the concentric groups. And so we can see that the eccentric muscle training was especially effective. We can see that combined in Colliander, that they have, they were again studying concentric and eccentric combined versus solely concentric. I don't want. I also want to clarify and note Higby here is recorded to average women, so that's why this is not so high. But the pattern is also consistent. That you can see eccentric muscle contractions were more effective to train with than the concentric. So this is also why they measured the neuromuscular connections that were going on. You can see that those improvements are significant and important. Sager, the same thing. The eccentric definitely was a significant finding in their study. So here's the cross-sectional area. This is also a common trait in all of the studies, or I rather should say in Sager and Higby. This is important. We're showing strength gains as your muscle grows. So Sager found a significant difference for both contraction types. You can kind of see where they were before and where they were after. This is a p-value greater or less than, than 0.05. So Higby also presents a significant difference. You can see again there was some improvement in the muscle mass before and after for the women. So really, that's some good finds to see that no matter what, you were finding growth in the muscle, you're finding strength in the muscle, and that the gains can be had. It's kind of being proven across the board, and I think these are really good points to be looking at. So going back to our research questions, so what is the difference between eccentric and concentric muscle training in relationship to morphology and strength adaptations in the extensor muscles? So this is for Sager. And they find that strength gains were made for both contractions, both types of contractions. They show that eccentric muscle contractions improved the most. Morphology showed a 5.7 increase in quadricep muscle cross-sectional areas. That's the graph we were just looking at. So 5% increase is pretty significant in that we can, that'd be a visual difference in muscle tone and strength. For Higbee, again, they asked what differences in strength and cross-section area and neural activation are there between concentric and eccentric muscle contractions. So what's important here for us to know in answer to that question is that training eccentrically improves concentric and eccentric strength. Training concentrically improved only concentric strength in their study, which makes a lot of sense and is very true. We can see those patterns going back to our graphs. So cross-section areas increased by 5% by concentric training and 6.6% in eccentric training. So way to go, ladies, in that study. That's again, pretty good gain. So our last question here with Colliander and Tesh. Is there a difference in strength gains by training purely concentrically, or are there the same or better results occurring with combined eccentric and concentric training? In this, they were able to prove that training with a combination of the eccentric and concentric contractions, again, going back to your gym of doing a bicep curl, pulling up and letting down at the same time, showed to be far more beneficial than training only with concentric contractions. Again, that's just if you are pulling up only and someone takes the weight away, you start down at the bottom and pull up. So there's definitely gains to be had by exercising in both. Applies the other two studies in saying that they showed that eccentric only training improved the overall strength of peak torques that they were testing. And so Colliander here combines those first two studies, and we can see that those gains can be had throughout. So let's get back here. I'm kind of live and looking at my desktop here. So in summary, you can see a difference between concentric and eccentric muscle training when they're being separated. We see that eccentric definitely is the higher road in showing improved gains, and that combined, they operate really well together. I'm really excited to look into these and start putting together my own ideas and conclusions in the future projects we're going to be doing. I'm also really curious to see what the peak torque would be over isometric training. What if you just hold the contraction and not have any motion to it, and maybe add some weight, see how that would result. So I get really curious over here, really passionate about it, everything that's happening. And so I hope that you found a little bit of interest in it. And it is an interesting topic. And anyway, thanks for the time and commentary, or listening to the commentary. Yeah, see you in class.